Welcome, everyone, to Collegium Institute's Annual Newman Lecture featuring Professor Eamon Duffy. Before I say anything else, allow me to thank you all for your patience and, moreover, thank our speaker for his perseverance. I had been plenty impressed with the sheer scale and force of his scholarship before the event, and now, having witnessed the grit of its author against overwhelming obstacles, I have some basic sense of how it all might have been achieved. Thank you, Amen. I'm Dan Sheely, and I'm the director of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, as well as the executive director of the University of Pennsylvania's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society, or PRUX. We are grateful to have as co-presenters the Penn Newman Catholic Center, which was the first Newman Center in America. It's been a privilege to work together with Penn Newman over the past decade to revive the legacy of Newman in our university community through a variety of events and programs, including this annual Newman Lecture, which has in the past featured the late Don Briel, Thomas Fow, Dave Devil, John Garvey, Paige Hochschild, and Bud Marr. The last of whom, by the way, also just published a new book, Seeking God with St. John Henry Newman, and was interviewed by Lisa Eschleman, one of our student fellows, for Collegium's new podcast, The Wheel. So please stay tuned for that. Today's event, however, is certainly the largest of our Newman lectures to date, drawing in close to 1,000 registrants from at least 11 countries, and what seemed like every US state, even while coinciding with the very first games of March Madness. That is dedication. And for that, we should acknowledge the generous support of our many co-sponsors, including the Harvard Catholic Forum, USC's Nova Forum for Catholic Thought, the University of Dallas's Program for Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture, the Portsmouth Institute, the MA program in Catholic Studies of the University of St. Thomas, the Lumen Christi Institute, the American Catholic Historical Association, the National Institute for Newman Studies, the Department of Catholic Studies at Duquesne, the University College Dublin Newman Center for the Study of Religion, the Irish Center for Faith and Culture at Maynooth University, and finally, the Center for Catholic Studies at Durham University. Now that we were able to summon what seems like almost as many co-sponsors as attendees is, of course, due in no small part to our speaker. A speaker who, at least in some circles, may be the academic equivalent of a rock star. I say that not just because of his extraordinary following, both mainstream and cult-like, both within the University Guild and the commercial B&N bookstore, but also because of the way in which his work, like the music, has been a force of what we might call creative destruction. Eamon Duffy's first major foray into the history of the Reformation was like, to borrow a famous image from Newman, when expressing his initial concerns about the plan to define papal infallibility, what he thought was prematurely, quote, sudden thunder in a clear sky, unquote. To call Duffy's monumental book, The Stripping of the Altars, field-changing, hardly does it justice. It did change the field, resetting the terms of scholarly debate for the next decade and well beyond it. And it compelled historians to reckon with the state power that was required to achieve the English Reformation more than perhaps they ever had before. Primarily, though, it reshaped our imagination about how Christianity itself might have been lived in the past, burying the standard paradigm of a moribund church and unveiling instead a sprawling late medieval Catholic community teeming with life and with faith. His monographs since then have solidified his place in the pantheon of early modern historians. But for our purposes today, it's worth pointing out, if I'm not mistaken, that his early articles addressed actually a later period, the Georgian Catholic Church of the 18th century. And so now he returns to that later phase of English Catholic history, moving into the Victorian era of the 19th century, with his new book, John Henry Newman, A Very Brief History. So for our format today, Professor Duffy will speak for roughly 30 minutes, followed by roughly 30 minutes of question and answer. There's no need to wait until Q&A starts in order to submit your question. If you'll just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question as soon as you're ready, that would be fine. I'll field the questions for our speaker and we'll do our best to address as many as possible. And with that, I will turn things over to Professor Duffy to address Newman and the limits of dogma.
Okay, thank you. After that introduction, I can't wait to hear what I have to say. In this talk, I want to reflect on an apparent contradiction in Newman's thought and his behavior. The Anglican Newman was notoriously a ferocious defender of doctrinal orthodoxy, at times even a heresy hunter. He thought the visible church, by which he meant the Anglican Church, was the custodian of God's truth, and that it was the duty of Christians to submit to the church's dogmatic teaching. As he famously wrote in the Apologia, from the age of 15, dogma has been the fundamental principle of my religion. I know no other religion. I cannot enter into the idea of any other sort of religion. And of course, he never abandoned that conviction. As a Catholic, he spoke repeatedly of the church as the oracle of God. And in his best known poem, the dying Gerontius declares, "And I hold in veneration for the love of him alone, Holy Church as his creation, and her teachings as his own." And yet, the most striking feature of Newman's Catholic career, at any rate from the early 1850s onwards, was his ardent opposition to dogmatism. He was consistently patient and supportive of correspondents and penitents who were troubled or doubting, and both in private and increasingly in public, he could be savagely critical of what he considered the overbearing exercise of authority in the church, most notoriously in his public opposition to the definition of papal infallibility and his slow and reluctant acceptance of the definition once it had been passed. It's superficially, at any rate, as if there were two Newmans, the Catholic and the Anglican. But I want to argue that there is, in fact, a strong thread of continuity between these two apparently very different frames of mind. Newman's Anglican campaigns for dogma were directed against two distinct targets. On the one hand, there was the evangelical party to which he himself had once belonged. He thought that evangelicals valued no doctrines unless they contributed directly to conversion. So evangelicals neglected or dismissed anything for which they couldn't see an immediate pastoral use. The doctrine of justification by faith seemed to them, he thought, the heart of the Christian faith, even though it didn't feature in any of the ancient creeds, whereas evangelicals of his time were prone to play down the importance of orthodox Trinitarian belief because it seemed arcane and abstract and didn't have a direct bearing on the great evangelical experience, conversion. And then, on the other hand, there were the rationalizers, liberalizing Christians like Dr. Thomas Arnold of Rugby, or nearer at hand in Oxford, Professor Wren Dixon Hampden, whom Newman pursued. They insisted on the rationality of Christianity and so viewed the doctrine of the Trinity not so much as a mystery, but rather mystification. So Newman thought they saw the church's historic dogma as at best complicating and at worst compromising the essential simplicity of the original and essentially moral teaching of Jesus. Newman believed that both evangelicals and rationalizers were alike in thinking that they knew exactly what Christianity was all about. Whereas for Newman, at the heart of the Christian faith was the immense mystery of God, about which human beings could speak only in stumbling metaphor. His own special field of study was the Greek writings of the early Christian fathers of the city of Alexandria: Origen, Clement of Alexandria, St. Athanasius. And from them, he learned to think of Christian doctrine as the necessary but inadequate attempt to put into the littleness of human language immensities that could only be hinted at. As he wrote in the Apologia, looking back to his Anglican days, I understood them to mean that the exterior world, physical and historical, was but the outward manifestation to our senses of realities greater than itself. Holy Church will remain even to the end of the world only a symbol of those heavenly facts which fill eternity. Her mysteries are but the expression in human language of truths to which the human mind is unequal. So, as an Anglican, Newman insisted on the need for humble reception of the solemn formularies of the faith, the Church's attempts, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, to speak of the essentially hidden things of God. He never forgot the inescapable limitations of creedal language. Dogmatic definitions, he thought, were necessary, but they were a tragic necessity imposed on the Church by the distortions of heretics. The technicality and formalism of doctrinal definitions always involved a diminishment of the mysteries that they were designed to articulate. As he said in one of his sermons, we count the words of the fathers and measure their sentences, and so convert doxologies into creeds. And the very fact that we're utterly in the dark about the relative importance or consistency of the separate articles of the faith is a reason not for setting them aside, but of holding fast to the form of sound words. Because again, as he said in a sermon, we have no means of knowing how far a small mistake in the faith may carry us astray. If we do not know why it is to be proclaimed to all, much less do we know why this or that doctrine is revealed, or what is the importance of it. But Newman made a wider claim than this to the faithful obedience of the believer. The articles of the Creed weren't just abstract notions. They were the seeds of a living religious system, manifestations of a life. The creeds weren't meant to be bare bones, the distilled essence or skeleton of Christianity. Meditated on, lived out, they blossomed in history into the great multifaceted complex organism that we call Christianity. The creeds, formulated before Christendom divided, were infallible. But even the fallible aspects of subsequent Christian life had value. So in addition to affirming the creeds, believers needed to attend to the whole body of the Church's life and teaching, the things that made up the shape of Christian living. To drive this home, Newman made a highly original distinction between what he called the episcopal tradition and the prophetical tradition in the Church. Episcopal tradition was the body of revealed truth, dogma, summarized in the creeds, confessed by us all at our baptism, and passed down the ages from bishop to bishop, in his words, to be received according to the capacity of each individual mind. But in addition, beyond that, there was a subordinate but still authoritative prophetical tradition, which represented the legitimate outworking of those fundamental beliefs as they'd shaped the living experience of the Church. This much wider prophetical tradition was, in his words, a vast system consisting of a certain body of truth permeating the Church like an atmosphere, irregular in its shape from its very profusion and exuberance, at times separable only in idea from the episcopal tradition, yet at times melting away into legend and fable, partly written, partly unwritten, partly the interpretation, partly the supplement of Scripture, partly preserved in intellectual expressions, partly latent in the spirit and temper of Christians, poured to and fro upon the housetops, in liturgies, in controversial works, in obscure fragments, in sermons, existing primarily in the bosom of the Church itself, and recorded in such measure as Providence has determined in the writings of eminent men. This prophetic tradition, its great baggy monster, was fallible and susceptible to corruption. Error and abuse had crept into it over time. Nevertheless, it originated with God. That whole body of teaching, worship, experience, and in a favorite tractarian word, ethos, the fallible as well as the infallible, was the vehicle through which saving truth actually reaches us. So he said the doctrine of the creed runs into the general prophetical tradition. There was no hard or fast line to be drawn between the fundamental truths of the creed and the embodiment and elaboration of those truths in the Church's experience and tradition. The prophetical tradition was a system to be inhabited and used, not quizzed or minimized. The appropriate frame of mind in matters of faith was a willingness to be taught, a reverent receptivity in the Christian, either to believe and love what he hears, or to wish to do so, or at least not to oppose, but to be silent. At the end of his Anglican career, Newman returned to these issues, which he'd been exploring in the late 1830s, from a rather different perspective. And the place where he revived his thinking about this was the essay on development. That book was written to provide a rationale for Newman's identification of the modern Roman Catholic Church with the ancient Church of the Fathers and the Councils. He now suggested that his earlier thinking about the prophetical tradition unwittingly constituted a powerful argument for the necessity of a living, infallible authority, such as was claimed by the Catholic Church. Christianity was a social religion. It was based on a creed acknowledged as divine in origin, but issuing, in his words, in a multiplicity of developments, true or false or mixed, which inevitably made distinct impressions on different minds. It therefore needed a supreme authority, ruling and reconciling individual judgments by a divine right and recognized wisdom, in order to discern true from false, benign from harmful. So he wrote, there can be no combination on the basis of truth without an organ of truth. If Christianity is both social and dogmatic and intended for all ages, it must, humanly speaking, have an infallible expounder. Now, as is well known, the essay on development represented Newman's realization that the formation of Christian tradition was a process that involved error as well as truth. Famously, in the essay, he suggested 7 tests or notes by which you could distinguish the true from the false. But as a Catholic, he would increasingly insist that this process required a communal process of discernment. Truth emerged from a labor in which many forces and many people had a hand. So for him, the infallibility of the church was shared by the whole church, expressed in different ways at different times. It was not the sole prerogative of the Pope, though he accepted that papal decisions had a special and privileged place in the process. Now, belief in infallibility would, of course, remain foundational for Newman's understanding of Catholicism. In the final chapter of the Apologia, he would articulate his own, in his phrase, absolute submission to that power of infallibility, which claims to know, I'm quoting, for certain, the very meaning of the divine message in detail. I believe, he wrote, the whole revealed dogma as taught by the apostles, as committed by the apostles to the church, and as declared by the church to me, and implicitly as it shall be in like manner further interpreted by that same authority till the end of time. But as his published letter to the Duke of Norfolk in 1874 would make clear, his understanding of infallibility was by no means the blank check for dogmatic authority that his words might seem to imply. So Newman, from his Anglican days, had a strong sense of the mysteriousness of Christian truth and a realization almost unique in the Catholic Church of the 19th century that doctrine, dogma, had a history, and that true doctrine emerged by a long cooperative labor of exploration of the mystery by the whole church. But in the Catholic Church of the 1850s and 60s, there were loud voices insisting that, in fact, Christian teaching was crystal clear, that we had an easy and immediate access to it in the person of the Pope. The church in the papacy had an oracle whose teaching cut through confusion and obscurity. Newman was increasingly alarmed by the hyper-Catholicism of those who regarded papal infallibility as a form of revelation on tap, a license to print new dogmas. For him, infallibility was essentially an instrument of last resort, an aid in determining, amidst all the richness and complexity of the tradition, what developments were true to the original depositum. Infallibility was neither inspiration nor a source of new knowledge. It was a condition, a guarantee that in discerning what was or wasn't a healthy development of the core Christian tradition, the church would not go fundamentally astray. But there was nothing slick or easy about that guarantee. There was a long historical process in which individual personalities, cultural circumstances, the passing of time, and what he called the clash of Catholic mind on Catholic mind, all had parts to play. And almost alone among Catholic theologians of the time, he thought the laity, as well as the clergy, had their role to play in discerning just what was central and what marginal to the church's faith. His Anglican studies of the history of the Arian controversies of the 4th century had taught him that back then, when most bishops had fallen into doctrinal error, It was the laity, in the form of the monks of Egypt, who had remained instinctively loyal to the faith of their fathers. Now, one of the most vocal of the propagandists for the papalist hyper-Catholicism that Newman deplored was one of his own former disciples, William George Ward, a convert from exactly the kind of rationalist liberal Christianity that Newman had fought as an Anglican. Ward had a rat trap sort of mind, open and shut, black and white, and he was now a gleeful cultural warrior, convinced of the imminence of what he called an internecine war between the army of dogma and the united hosts of indifferentism and unbelief. Ward looked to unlimited papal infallibility as the one solid and inexpugnable fortress for the army of dogma. Those are his words, and notice the confrontational military metaphor. So he wrote, "We cannot submit to the Pope's authority by halves. We cannot accept what we please and reject what we please. We must humbly embrace that whole body of Christian doctrine which he infallibly inculcates." For Newman, by contrast, the reckless inflation by which every formal papal utterance was deemed to become dogma only served to undermine real confidence in the Church as teacher. To treat papal teaching as above and beyond conditions or controls was, he believed, a disturbing novelty. Truth required a process which couldn't be short-circuited. The discernment of doctrine was an aspect of the Church's inescapable journey through time. To attempt shortcuts was to try to evade the means by which the life of the Spirit guided the Church into truth. So he wrote, "This age of the Church is peculiar. In former times, there was not the extreme centralization which is now in use. If a private theologian said anything, another answered him. If the controversy grew, then it went to a bishop or a theological faculty to some foreign university. The Holy See was but the court of ultimate appeal. But now, if I, as a private priest, put anything in print, propaganda, that's the curial body that controlled the Church in England, propaganda answers me at once. How can I fight with such a chain on my arm? There was true private judgment in the primitive and medieval schools. There are no schools now, no private judgment in the religious sense of that phrase, no freedom of opinion. That is, no exercise of the intellect. This is a way of things which, in God's own time, will work its own cure of necessity." Newman rejected cultural warfare, which he thought sterilized the Church's mission to address the world and locked it into a ghetto. So he complained to his friend Emily Bowles, "We are shrinking into ourselves, narrowing the lines of communion, trembling at freedom of thought, and using the language of dismay and despair at the prospect before us." So it was inevitable in the 1860s that he would turn his attention to the debates about infallibility. In 1865, as the First Vatican Council began to be planned, Newman began a series of jottings in his private notebooks on the limits of papal teaching. And those notebooks make fascinating reading. Papal and other solemn ecclesiastical condemnations, he believed, were often statements of abstract principles which couldn't be taken as simple directives either for thought or action, as extremists like Ward wanted to treat them. Reason and common sense governed the practical application of abstract principle, even in matters of morals and doctrine. In practice, those concrete applications might in practice amount to direct contradiction. One of his favorite examples, which he comes back to again and again, was Pope Benedict XIV's 1745 encyclical Vix Pervenit, in which the Pope had unequivocally reaffirmed the medieval church's absolute ban on lending and borrowing of money at interest. But in 1745, the year of that encyclical, the whole Catholic world, including Pope Benedict XIV, routinely borrowed and loaned money at interest. So, Newman argued, the encyclical was what he calls a dogmatic brief. And he wrote, "I believe neither at the time nor now, still more, has it any practical use whatever." It followed that Catholics were not obliged to give unlimited internal assent to encyclicals or other routine papal utterances, which often articulated ideals, but which were often clearly detached from actual circumstances. There were no shortcuts, therefore, to religious certainty. There was no tap to turn whenever doctrinal or moral guidance was desired, because there was no substitute for time and prayerful engagement. His opposition to the definition of infallibility in 1870 was motivated in large part by his conviction that things, in his words, were moving too fast at Rome. Doctrinal development and the discernment of the Church's faith was necessarily the outcome of a collaborative process, one that took time, typically centuries. So, as he wrote to Father Robert Whitty, "We do not move at railroad pace in theological matters, even in the 19th century. The Church moves as a whole. It's not a mere philosophy, it is a communion. What we require, first of all, and it is the work of years, is a careful consideration of the acts of councils, the deeds of popes, the bullarium. We need to try the doctrine by facts to see what it may mean, what it cannot mean, what it must mean. We must try its future working by the past. And we need that this should be done in the face of day, in course, in quiet, in various schools and centers of thought, in controversy. This is the true way in which those who differ sift out the truth." These were dangerous views in the 1860s and 70s, and he repeatedly lamented the lack of intellectual freedom in Pio Nono's church. But Newman rarely criticized authority in print, and never papal authority, at any rate directly. The discrepancy between Newman's public deference on the one hand and his repeated and often rather violent complaints in private about the actual exercise of authority in the church, on the other hand, were a source of frustration to many of his friends. Newman explained his silence as the product of his own gradualist ecclesiology. Truth emerged not from confrontational gestures, but from the corrective and necessarily drawn-out processes of debate, assimilation, and reception of ideas. Dogmatism might be the vice not merely of the authorities, but also of theologians and speculative thinkers, whose views, even when true, might wound consciences if they were articulated prematurely. There was a duty to step delicately where the faith and sensibilities of others were in question. The duty of obedience might occasion, in his words, silence and acquiescence, or at least very cautious and restrained avowals of opposition. That was his public stance. In private, he was clear about his determined opposition to dogmatism as opposed to dogma. To those struggling with the infallibility definition, his advice was both practical and humane, and in striking continuity with what he had argued about the duty of an Anglican towards the prophetical tradition. Back then in the 1830s, he'd said that the Anglican believer had an obligation to believe and love what he hears, or to wish to do so, or at least not to oppose, but to be silent. To Catholics troubled about the 1870 definition, he advised, "Your duty lies in observing two conditions, both of them in your power. First, make an act of faith in all that Holy Church teaches. And secondly, as regards this particular doctrine, turn away from any doubt which rises in your mind about its truth. These two acts are in your power, and they are sufficient." Newman had a deep and pragmatic confidence in the persistence of truth in the Church. But he was clear that trial and error were part of that process and persistence. Truth was the daughter of time. The life of the Church was a dialectical process from which, in God's good time, balance would emerge. So, in the wake of what he thought the burdensome new doctrine of papal infallibility, time would soften and clarify what it actually meant. As he wrote, a new pope and a reassembled council in time would trim the boat. Newman explained to one of his penitents, William Maskell, "Be still and see the salvation of God. I think things in time will gradually settle down and find their level. The rationale or theory which is to be held with reference to what has been done in Rome will come out distinctly. We can't force things. The council cannot force things. The voice of the Schola Theologorum, of the whole church diffusive, will in time make itself heard, and Catholic instincts and ideas will assimilate and harmonize into the credenda of Christendom and the living tradition of the faithful, what at present many would impose upon us, and many are startled at, as a momentous addition to the faith." Newman's last great theological work revisited his Anglican thought about tradition and dogma in the light of those Catholic developments. In 1877, he republished his Anglican lectures on the prophetical office, but now with a momentous preface that was in part an argument with his younger Anglican self, and in part a distillation of what these recent Catholic debates about infallibility had taught him. The preface to the third edition of the Via Media, 1877, is a highly original theological essay, hardly less original than the essay on development. In it, Newman challenged openly the monolithic understanding of the Church which seemed to have triumphed at Vatican I, in which authority, hierarchy, or governance, what we would call the magisterium, determine all aspects of religious life. And instead, he proposed a radically dynamic model of the Church, in which three very different but complementary energies constituted the Church's vitality, three principles or offices that existed in permanent but creative tension. Newman relates these three energies to the threefold offices which unite in Christ: the prophetical office, standing here not as in his Anglican lectures for the whole ethos of Christianity, but variously for revelation, for Christian teaching in all its forms, for the practice of theology, and for rational thought in religious matters. The second office was the priestly, which he explains as representing the spiritual, devotional, or what Friedrich von Hugel would later call the mystical elements of religion, everything from the celebration of the sacraments down to the practices of folk religion. And lastly, there was the kingly or royal office, which Newman took as representing rule, governance, structure, institution, and being embodied in the papacy and its central institutions, the curia. Interestingly, he doesn't talk about the episcopate at all. These three powers or offices were, he argued, all essential and equal constituents of the concrete historical reality of the body of Christ. But their different objects and scope inevitably meant that they pulled in quite different directions. So in a famous formulation, he wrote, "Truth is the guiding principle of theology and theological inquiry. Devotion and edification, the guiding principle of worship, and of government, expedience. The instrument of theology is reasoning, of worship, our emotional nature, of rule, command and coercion. Further, in man as he is, reasoning tends to rationalism, devotion to superstition and enthusiasm, and power to ambition and tyranny." So the balance between these three, essential to the health of the church, is always precarious and in practice never adequately attained. Who, he wrote, even with divine aid, shall successfully administer offices so independent of each other, so divergent and so conflicting? What line of conduct, except on the long, the very long run, is at once edifying, expedient, and true? Newman here rejected any neatly hierarchical model of the church as a pyramid in which truth equaled authority and descended from above. His intention was to argue for an irreducibly dynamic understanding of the life of the church, which reflected the ultimate ineffability of divine mystery itself, and which therefore had to be worked at and often arrived at through tension and even conflict. The life of the church is inescapably caught up in historical process. Even the truths of the faith are implicated in the mess of history, and to proclaim them anew in changing cultures and circumstance, room had to be made for intellectual trial and error, the legitimate freedom of theological exploration, or in his words in The Idea of a University, elbow room for great minds. The life of the church could never be one of a sealed and self-sufficient balance raised tranquilly above confusion, contradiction, and error. Its life was a dialectical process, rich and life-giving, but consequently messy, and the tensions between the sometimes conflicting claims of truth, expedience, and devotion would not be finally resolved this side of the eschaton. They had to be lived with. As he wrote in words that echoed his remarks about the Alexandrian fathers in the Apologia, "Whatever is great refuses to be reduced to human rule and to be made consistent in its many aspects with itself. Who shall reconcile with each other the various attributes of the infinite God? This living world to which we belong, how self-contradictory it is when we attempt to measure and master its meaning and scope. We need not feel surprised then if Holy Church too, the supernatural creation of God, is an instance of the same law, crossed and discredited now and again by apparent anomalies which need and which claim at our hands an exercise of faith.